Here we go. Jung and Astrology. This is an introduction and an overview. My name is James Newell. I'm the director of the Depth Psychology Alliance. Welcome, everyone. Glad to have you. This is a very fascinating topic, and it's a rich and complex topic. It's neither Jung or Jungian psychology nor astrology is really difficult to learn, but both of them are fairly complex. There's a, a lot of constituent parts to each of these things. So I'm going to take it slow, I hope, and going to try to cover a lot of material. There's a lot of ways we can go with this. Once we get into the course, those of you who continue on with us in the course, very happy to try to tailor things to areas that hold the most interest for people, given the sort of broad outline that I'm going to present today. So first of all, just to be clear, this is not a course on astrology per se. It's a course on Jung and his use of astrology. We've done many courses on Jung, including Jung in fairy tales, Jung in mythology, Jung in alchemy, and this is along those lines. We're going to be looking at how Jung used astrology. So if you're joining this class because you're interested in a course that's going to teach you about astrology or how to calculate a birth chart or anything like that, this is probably not the course that you want to take. There may be some things of interest here, but you're not going to learn everything about astrology. We will cover some things, particularly for people who have no knowledge of astrology, just as we'll also cover some things, basics about Jungian psychology for those of you who haven't been exposed to too much Jungian theory. So we'll cover some of the basics, particularly in the first module. I'm just going to give an overview today. But everything that we do look at in the course, the basics and the history and all of that, we're going to be looking at it from the context of Jung's basic theory. And in that sense, it'll be necessary, as I say, to know a little bit about the basic theory, which I'll try to cover some of that today. And we'll be kind of going in and out of that. And at any time, as I say, if I'm using terminology or talking about an area that you're not clear about, just let me know and I'll try to clarify as best I can. So, like I say, I'm not an expert in astrology. I'm not an astrologer. I like to tell people I know just enough about astrology to be dangerous. I do have a big bookcase full of astrology books. I've read a lot about astrology. I think, like Jung, I think I started just recognizing that there was a lot of things, particularly I was trying to understand Jung and alchemy, and these astrological symbols kept coming up in his alchemical texts. And I thought, well, okay, astrology is a mythological system. I can study it on that basis. I was very skeptical, really, about astrology, but was astonished. When you get into astrology, it's I mean, I don't want to, as I'll continue to say, I want to try to have a very even and balanced approach to this. But once you start working with these symbols and with the whole system, it's quite amazing what emerges. What emerges archetypally in you, and just the synchronicity that goes on. And any of you who have worked with astrology before certainly don't need to be reminded about that. So knowing about astrology is good. Knowing about something about these symbols is good, just to understand some of the leaps and things that Jung makes in his writings. An important element of Jung's theory is the collective unconscious, the idea of the collective unconscious and the constituents of the collective unconscious, which are the archetypes. I like to say that the personal unconscious, which is that area of the unconscious that is specific to individuals and their life story. The constituents of the personal unconscious are the complexes, and the constituents of the collective unconscious are the archetypes. And archetypes, of course, there is always an archetype, according to Jung, at the core of a complex. We won't get deeply into that, but that's just, those kind of things will come up as we go along. So, and I'll say more about the archetypes in a few minutes as we get into Jung's theory. But what I want to emphasize about astrology in relation to archetypes is the human tendency to derive meaning from the evening sky. And this idea fits completely and really perfectly into Jung's definition and his idea of the archetype of archetypes and the archetypal and what is archetypal. So in this sense, astrology really is one of the most archetypal remnants of ancient culture that is still with us and active today. In other words, alchemy has split off and become chemistry. Astronomy has split off from astrology and become its own discipline. But alchemy as a independent discipline, there are people practicing it, but Jung kind of speaks derisively of that kind of alchemy that's not involved with matter. But there are still people, as many of you know, who work with astrology and derive a lot of benefit from it. And just to get into a definition of, this is the full definition, just kind of a passing definition of archetypes. Jungian analyst Anthony Stevens, who is an author I recommend highly, says that, quote, whenever a phenomenon is found to be characteristic of all human communities, irrespective of culture, race, or historical epoch, then it is an expression of an archetype of the collective unconscious, end of quote. And there's a lot to unpack there. I'm going to just kind of buzz over it, but simply to say that this is absolutely true of astrology. The roots of modern Western astrology can be placed back at least as far as 1700 to 1900 BCE, that is before the Christian era in Mesopotamia. But even beyond that, there's earlier evidence, such as marks on bones and cave walls, that suggest that lunar and other astronomical cycles were being measured as early as 25,000 years ago. Of course, we don't know how they interpreted those or if they derived meaning out of it the way astrologers do today. But people were definitely paying attention to that, and there's a reason for that, particularly in the Neolithic period when agriculture began to be developed. People noticed by watching, they didn't have TV, they didn't have Netflix, they would watch the evening sky, and they noticed these cycles that would come through and would sort of herald that it was going to be time for the crops to come in, or it was going to be time for winter was going to be coming on. And this could really be life-saving for tribal people, to know when winter's coming so you can prepare for winter. And so people began to interpret that these signs, well, they must be coming from some divine order that's sending these to us. So it began to be a survival mechanism that constellated, as we say in Jungian psychology, constellated all of these archetypal numinous feelings in people. And this is sort of the beginning of astrology in the very, very ancient world. And we'll talk a lot more about that history in Module 2. Again, when we do talk about the history, I want to be talking about it in terms of the psyche. And I'll get into why that is as we go along. But another point, as we start out in this sort of sojourn, is to recognize that, broadly speaking, there are generally two schools of thought regarding astrology. One school of thought says that astrology is a divine science. The other school of thought says that astrology is a pseudoscience. And my own training is in counseling and religious studies. And in the field of history of religions, we try to approach topics from a position that we call methodological agnosticism, which is to say that we try to describe what people believe in different religious systems without saying, well, this system is better than that one, or this one is not so good, this one does that. In other words, there's no qualitative assessment of the religions. And likewise, I don't want to make a qualitative, even though my biases will become clear as we go through. Obviously, I probably wouldn't be teaching a course like this if I didn't find astrology fascinating. But still, we want to be able to present both sides, not just both sides, but we want to get as close as we can to truth, if truth is available. But so we want to just look at what's out there. Why is science continue to be derisive of astrology? And on the other hand, why, in the face of that, do people keep finding meaning and worth in astrology? So these are things that will come up throughout the course. We'll particularly talk about it a lot more in Module 7. But equally, when we study, for example, Christianity, or we study Islam, there are many, 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 many ways people approach Christianity, many ways they approach Buddhism. And if you ask one person, they'll say, well, this is the way it's done. I ask someone else, no, it's done this way. So we want to describe, likewise, there are many, many different types of astrologers. And each type of astrologer may have some commonalities, but they may also understand astrology in very different ways. So we want to, again, be descriptive as we go through this without laying claim to one being better than the other. Clearly, those types that are congruent with and conducive with Jungian psychology are going to be closer to my heart than ones that are, farther away from Jung's ideas. So, but we'll be in that whole spectrum. There's Eastern, there's Vedic astrology, there's Chinese astrology, there's many different approaches. We're going to be focusing mainly, probably exclusively on Western astrology, and particularly the kind of Western astrology that Jung studied during his lifetime, and the kind of astrology that sort of branched out from Jung's influence, which we'll talk about a lot more in Module 8. So, to be clear, even hard-nosed scientists, if they're really looking at facts, have to admit that astrology is a science. To quote the historian Benson Bobrick, who wrote the book Faded Sky, Astrology and History, he says, astrology is an applied science insofar as it is based on astronomy. It's an exact science insofar as its judgments are based on mathematical calculations, and it's an empirical science insofar as its deductions are based on data gathered over the course of time. So there's this separates it out very much from a lot of, I'm talking about it as a mythological system, because the use of archetype and myth can be very powerful and very useful in astrology. And yet, this isn't just random hoodoo. There's some very concrete things that are brought to bear in astrology. Now, again, all this data is gathered through these empirical methods, but how one understands it and interprets it, and what ideas people arrive at through these calculations is going to be open to debate, as I say, outside of people who work with astrology, as well as even in the community of people who work with astrology. There's differences of opinion. But what is not open to debate is the fact that the origins of many of our most important sciences can be traced to astrology. Again, to quote Bobrick, he says, quote, "From astrology are derived astronomy, calculation of time, mathematics, medicine, botany, mineralogy, and, by way of alchemy, modern chemistry, among other disciplines. For example, logarithms were originally devised to simplify the calculations necessary in casting horoscopes, etc." There are many other things we can trace to that. Some of the greatest scientists, including Newton and Galileo, used to make part of his living from casting horoscopes. The great Copernicus, although he kind of his work was one of the ones that brought astrology into question, but he still was someone who absolutely worked in the field of astrology. So, even given all that, there are many people in the hard sciences who understand astrology very differently from the way ancient peoples have understood it. And these are intellectuals who try to debunk astrology at every turn. And it's important to be aware of that when we're reading Jung, because Jung was not always as outspoken as he might have been about his interest in astrology, because he was already under fire from intellectuals and other psychologists and people because they didn't understand. He was always interested in fringe things because he recognized that this is where these anomalies, this area that's repressed, is exactly where the compensatory, his part of his theory was always that the unconscious compensates consciousness, and the compensations for the overweighted intellectual, cognitive, hyper-rational thinking process, he found the compensation for that in these areas, such as alchemy, such as mythology, such as astrology. So when we read his own words about astrology, he often is speaking in terms of amplifications and things in his published work. I'm talking about. It was only later in life that he let more of what he thought about astrology get into his published work, but a lot of it comes out in his letters. to colleagues, even to Freud. This earliest mention of him looking at astrology was a letter to Freud saying that his evenings were mostly taken up with astrology. And at that time, they were both pursuing different areas of mythology in order to understand the workings of the mind and the workings of the unconscious. And Jung, as I say, my feeling, I don't see anywhere where he actually says this, but I think that he began to approach astrology with just this sort of sense of a curiosity, and then was kind of stunned by what he encountered as he worked more and more with astrological charts and things, and we'll see a little bit more about that as we go along. But so in order to understand why he would have been interested, being a hard scientist as he was trying to be, why he would have been interested in astrology in the first place, we want to know what exactly was he doing. And in general, we can say that Jung's main interest was the psyche, was how the psyche worked. He wanted to know how energies became blocked, how these blocked energies would cause people to become neurotic, and then how these energies could be freed up so that people could utilize these energies to become more creative, more productive, and more emotionally stable. So Jung's initial interest in astrology paralleled his interest in mythology. As I say, he was around this time he began studying mythology intensely, and this led to the publication of his book Symbols of Transformation, which led to his break with Sigmund Freud, and led to him coming up with the theory of archetype. And I'll get into a little bit more of that. I'm not going to get into his history in this class, but we'll get into a little bit more of that as we go through. But wherever we may be on the spectrum in terms of our understanding of astrology, we can all agree that an important aspect of astrology is its use of mythology and mythological symbolism. Along with alchemy, it is one of the most complex and rich sources of mythological symbolism in all of the Western intellectual traditions. In Western traditions like alchemy, astrological symbolism often provides a connecting link between many of the pre-Christian European mythologies and the pre-Enlightenment European culture that was more or less first squashed by, Jung would say, squashed by the Christian dogmas, and then secondly, squashed by science. So he's always trying to get back to that, not in a regressive way, but because he wants to, as we'll see in a moment, he wants to maintain this ego-self axis where we still have, we're still in touch with the roots of our instinctual being while still being able to operate in a cognitive, rational way in the rational world with other rational people, but we don't split ourselves off and dissociate from the roots of our being. So that was sort of his project. And partly thanks to Jung, but partly because it's just the nature of astrology, is that astrologers typically use mythological associations to amplify astrological charts in much the same way that Jung uses mythology to amplify the dreams and the active imagination fantasies of his patients. In other words, if there's the element of fire is in someone's chart, and there's another similar type of, say there's Mars is somewhere close by, then it's recognized that there's a relationship, a parallel there, and depending on the symbolic, the symbols that people are working with on those, they can help the fire on one hand and the planetary symbolism on the other can help to inform maybe another planet that's in a similar sign, etc. They're all going to be, as we say in Jungian psychology, we say amplified, which means that the stories that appear in different traditions can come to conclusions that we wouldn't have necessarily drawn, and we might be able to cross-reference them and inform. One storyline can inform another one where we hadn't expected it to appear. So to get into the roots of what Jung was doing with astrology, I want to emphasize again that his main project was always the well-being of his patients. He saw himself as a medical doctor and as a scientist and as someone who had a responsibility to those who came to him for help. So we don't have time here to go into the history and the development of Jung's thought, but I do want to survey some of his understanding of what he called the individuation process, and along with some of the typical terminology that he used, and that'll help us to lay some groundwork for how he understood astrology, how he used it to begin with, and then how he began to frame philosophical and psychological and intellectual questions in relation to basic human encounters with the world and with with our own psyches. So to begin with, this little diagram here, it's one that if anyone's taken my classes before, they're going to be familiar with this because I'm bringing up all. It's just it doesn't show the complexes. It doesn't show specific archetypes in the collective unconscious, but it gives you a basic idea of the Jungian psyche, and this is not a picture of the psyche. If you cut open someone's brain, you're not going to see a persona and an ego and a self and all that. But these are metaphorical ways of representing the way the psyche is understood by Jung and the way it's sort of developed as we mature through the life cycle. So generally, just to give you some basic terms, of course, there's consciousness, which is demarcated here between consciousness and the unconscious. The unconscious is demarcated between the personal unconscious and a collective unconscious, which, as I said, that's our personal history, we could say, and our complexes are going to primarily be here in the personal unconscious, and the archetypes and the common biological structure of the central nervous system, which Jung identified as the collective unconscious, is going to be located here. And I won't get too much into the archetype of the self, but this for Jung is a central organizing principle of the psyche. And as I said earlier, there's an archetype at the core of every complex, and the ego complex, the archetype Jung would say at the core of the ego complex. Complex for Jung is not always negative. Complex can be a very positive thing. There's a persona complex, there's a shadow complex, there's an ego complex. You can have a positive mother complex or a positive father complex. It's just the network of emotional connections that we have around, as he calls it, it's a feeling-toned collection of ideas with an archetype at the core. But the persona is what we develop as we mature and begin to function in society, and the ego is the center of consciousness, but the self is the center of the organism. Pardon me, not just the center of the conscious ego. One of the problems with modern people is that we think that the ego is the center of the organism, and it's not. As Jung would say, it's the self. So, Jung's two primary methods for accessing the unconscious are dream analysis and active imagination. So, why are we interested in accessing the unconscious? The answer is that in order to facilitate psychological maturation by freeing up blocked psychological energy, we have to be able to tease apart these complexes and free up that energy so it can be used for creative purposes. So what then is individuation? Individuation is the word that Jung used to describe the differentiation of the conscious ego from the unconscious self. As Jung says, the aim of individuation is nothing less than to divest the self of the false wrappings of the persona on the one hand, that's this up here, and the suggestive power of the primordial images on the other. And that would be the primordial images, just his way of representing the archetypes. So the ego, there's an objective world outside, which the persona deals with, and there's an objective world inside, which is composed of the complexes and the archetypes. And the ego needs to be able to be in conversant with all of these, but not overwhelmed and possessed by any of these. So this is one way in this diagram to illustrate the slow process of this differentiation of the ego from the self, of separating, so neither the primordial images nor the persona is operating unconsciously. And the early phase, this is sort of an identification. As a child would be identified with the mother, the psyche is completely encased in the self. As we gain a little bit more consciousness, we separate a little bit, become more conscious as we mature more and more. Now, this is what Jung calls the ego-self axis, and this is how we maintain this. Even though we're differentiating, we still need to maintain a connection with the roots of our being. If this axis is not there, if we are not in touch with our own unconscious, then we suffer dissociations, we suffer the possibility of being possessed by an archetype or being just alienated from an archetype. And the alienation is usually manifests as depression. We have no life energy. We can't get anything going. On the other hand, when the archetype possesses the ego, then the ego thinks that it's the archetype. The ego thinks it's God. It's full of energy, but it's likely to plow right into a wall because it thinks it can do more than it can do because it's possessed by an archetype. It's possessed more or less, we could say, by a god. And when we think we're a god, we're going to have a fall at some point very soon. But gradually, as one matures, a greater sense of personal identity develops, and one experiences oneself as individual, distinct from the mother and father, and distinct from the role that one plays in the community. So the first phase of this is social adaptation and the development of the persona, as I was saying earlier. However, the very act of developing and establishing a strong ego structure, developing a persona, and a particular identity in the social group necessarily means holding certain other natural tendencies in abeyance and not allowing them access to consciousness, not allowing them to be perceived by people around us. So as a result, the second phase of the individual, this of course develops the shadow, which is sort of you couldn't really develop a shadow if you didn't first develop a persona. And the shadow is all these, sort of a conglomeration of all these split off things in the unconscious. So because of this, the second phase of the individuation process involves turning towards the unconscious and reconnecting not only with one's own personal past and repressed negative tendencies, but also reconnecting with our natural archetypal endowment as human beings. And there's a lot more to that. That's sort of a Reader's Digest version. But to kind of slim it down, we could say that there are essentially two types of individuation. One is a natural process, and the other we would call, Yolanda Jacobi calls, an artificial process. So individuation is essentially a natural developmental process that all living beings go through. In other words, an acorn, the individuation process for an acorn is to become an oak tree. And if there's a rock, or if there's not enough water, if there's not enough environment there to allow the archetypal intent, Anthony Stevens would say, to fulfill itself, then the oak tree either won't develop or it will develop in a sort of a twisted and a malformed way. Same thing with human beings. If we don't have an environment that provides us all the things that our archetypal intent expects, then we kind of can go haywire in different ways. That's the natural developmental process. Now, as human beings have developed, we've developed this hyper-rational cognitive function that's allowed us to develop tools and language and culture, and this has caused us to dissociate from this core, this archetypal core, this instinctual core of our being. And because of that, human beings, according to Jung, have developed the adaptive processes of religious practices, ritual, and myth that have historically helped us to provide a natural individuation process. In other words, we're not in touch with this sort of numinous instinctual energy, but when we bow before something that catches that projection, when we believe in a god, or we are encased in a mythological system, Jung would call it, that constellates our archetypes, that allows us to really experience that core of ourselves, we can be very healthy as long as we stay within that system. As we've developed over time, of course, the sort of hyper-rational part questions all of these systems, and they begin to fall apart, and we lose what sociologist Peter Berger calls the sacred canopy. We're no longer protected by a mythological system, and this is why Joseph Campbell and, of course, Jung and Eliade and others say we need myths so much in order to reconnect us with that, what Jung would say, this projection of our archetypal core is no longer being experienced out there. So we need to embark on what we would call the artificial individuation process, where we consciously engage through doing individual inner work, working with the therapist, or whatever path we take in order to try to reconnect with that instinctual core that we've lost touch with through the natural evolution of our species. So we call the process artificial because the proactive involvement of consciousness is very different from the sort of instinctual growth of an oak tree, for example. We are recognizing that we're becoming dissociated, we're feeling a little alienated, and we begin to either practice some sort of religious practice that, or some sort of spiritual practice that enlivens us, or we go into therapy and we begin to work that way, or we could begin to work with astrology, for example, or something where we feel that we're connecting with those archetypes again. It's easy to try to rush this artificial process, but it has to be approached patiently. We can't just take a weekend workshop and think we're going to suddenly reconnect with that part of ourselves. It's a long process. As Jung has seen, it's very much paralleled in the alchemy experiments. He's been able to draw out parallels between what the alchemists were doing, but he also saw parallels in the work of astrology and astrologers, and a way through that process of reconnecting with the archetype of the self and the inner instinctual roots of our being. So in addition to two types of individuation, there's also, and I've already touched on this, there are two stages of individuation. And the first stage, as I've said, is the essential task of the first half of life. It involves the natural development of personality, social adaptation, developing a persona, finding a mate, developing a work path, finding one's place in society, being a functioning human being, being able to do all this without just collapsing and not being able to kind of make things work. So that's the first stage of individuation. What Jung worked on primarily, a lot of people would come to him who had been successful in life and had done things, but they're just feeling completely alienated, completely variety of neurotic symptoms would be appearing. And he routinely found that there was a sort of a spiritual malaise in these people, that they no longer had this connection, this spiritual connection to a religious system or to even the natural world. Just reconnecting with the natural world sometimes would help to heal people. Sometimes he would just encourage people, if they had been religious, or they had a history of religious belief, he would encourage them to go to Mass, and sometimes that would be just all they needed. They would go to Mass and they could function with that way, and they'd be happy. But if that doesn't work, then a lot of the work he did with people was to focus on this second stage of life, where one learns to integrate the shadow, one learns to regulate the energies of the collective unconscious. So you're neither possessed by an archetype, nor are you alienated from the archetypes, and you're able to, we're not going to go into the whole process of it, but we'll touch on this as we go through the course in various ways. But the idea is to manage and steward those energies, rather than to feel that we are those energies. We're neither alienated from them, nor are we possessed by them. We're able to steward them. We're able to sort of bow to them and recognize that we are not the energies. We are not an archetype, but we can have access to the archetypes. We can steward the energy and use that energy to help people in our community, our families, and the world, hopefully. So it's important to know what stage of individuation process we're working on. It's important to know that the tasks required of the first stage are building a strong ego and a functional relationship with the other world. And these are very different from the tasks required for the second stage, which often means withdrawing. And not always. If you're already an introvert, it may mean that you need to get out in the world more. We're not going to get into the psychological types. There are four functions. We will get into that as we go through the course, because the four functions correspond to the elements in the astrological chart, but that will come later. But there are four functions, and there's introvert and extrovert. So the idea is to be rather than an introvert or extrovert, as Erich Neumann Jungian analyst calls it, you want to become a centrovert, where you're comfortable being out in the world and you're also comfortable withdrawing. But whatever it is, we want to compensate whatever's been overcompensated in the first half of life. You want to be able to compensate that and address that in the second stage of life. And of course, again, another anomaly in all this is when there's trauma involved. This can set things on a whole different path, and sometimes, especially someone who's dealing with trauma, may have to work on both stages at the same time. They may have to go back and rescue part of themselves from the trauma experience, and at the same time be building sort of first stage of individuation process stuff of being able to function better in the world. So that's sort of a general outline of some of the important aspects of this. But all of this, as we go back to this chart, all of this is about for Jung, it's always the differentiation of the ego. It's not simply progressing, because you can progress without ever differentiating the ego from the unconscious. The idea is always to be unconscious. And he borrowed an anthropological term from an anthropologist, a French anthropologist named Levi Bruhl. He took the phrase participation mystique, or mystical participation, which is this state when everything is in the unconscious, and you're identified and you're not really quite conscious enough. And in that state, we tend to, we tend to project the unconscious out into the world and into other objects of the world. This is a diagram of a child psyche, and a basic sort of description of the defense mechanism of projection is what's being described here. Freud had a whole list of defense mechanisms. One of them was projection, and this is one that Jung also subscribed to. There's whenever we see something unknown in the world, a little anxiety, a little unconscious anxiety exists, and we say, oh, I don't know what that is. And we reach around, this happens all spontaneously, but we reach around in the unconscious to try to find something that corresponds to what we're seeing in the outer world. And without even knowing it, we unconsciously project. If we see a really bossy person who's running our office, and we had a very bossy father or a bossy mother, we may tend to anticipate that person is going to behave in that way because we've projected that. And whatever unlived business we have with our mother or father, we're going to end up unconsciously working it out with this other authority figure. Now, why am I going into this? Because it's just to explain the process of projection. Because, for example, when Jung was looking at the alchemists, his understanding of how alchemy was helpful to him and why he could perceive and discern archetypal structures in the work of the alchemists was that he saw that the alchemists, as you see in this picture, were working with an alembic, they're working with chemicals, and yet what they saw in the alembic, what they saw in the test tube, and in the thing they were working with, they'd see dragons, and they'd see fires, and they'd see civilizations rise and fall. And of course, they weren't seeing any of that. This is all their unconscious being projected, as this man is seeing a little baby being projected. Call this the homunculus, being projected into the alembic. Jung says, well, that was his unconscious. And because they were writing about this and writing about processes and fantasizing about processes, he saw them projecting into their alchemical work the same kind of processes that presage the individuation process. And this isn't, of course, on alchemy, so I'm not going to get into all of that. But in the same way that the alchemists projected into the alembic, in the ancient world, when the ancient people would look up at the sky, as we look up at the sky typically, since we no longer have a sacred canopy and we don't typically think that the gods are up there, we see something like this. We see the stars. Most of us can't actually see the Milky Way, but we see something very like what's in this picture. But ancient people began to work with the sky more and more and more, and look at it and learn that the constellations would move and they could identify them and they'd give them personalities. And eventually when they looked up at the sky, they would see something like this. They would see Leo the lion, they would see the Gemini twins, they'd see Sagittarius the archer, they would see all this, and all of this began to appear, and yet at the same time they're getting absolutely concrete messages about the weather, about the shifting of the seasons, and over thousands and thousands of years, systems began to develop. And what happened as human culture in general began to separate the ego from the self, this identification, this differentiation of the ego from the unconscious. This on the far right, where they're both completely separated. This is, we could say, is where the development of astronomy came. There was no longer a projection of unconscious things on the sky, or at least for the most part there weren't. However, this little bar here, the ego-self axis, in many, many, many cases, is also severed. And so you get people saying, well, I know exactly what's going on. It's not this. There's nothing mystical or anything like that. It's just there was a big bang and everything exploded. Of course, that doesn't tell us anything, because we don't know what banged, who made it bang, why did it bang, why did, and anyone who can look up at the sky and not perceive a great mystery is just not being honest. There are people like Carl Sagan and others who write with they'll debunk anything about astrology or any of the kind of stuff that Jung talks about. But at the same time, they'll wax poetic about the beauty and the grandeur and everything of the universe and all that. Well, that, at least by doing that, they're maintaining some kind of an ego-self axis, because they're in touch with the mystery. Anyone who can say there's no mystery up there is not really in touch with just how vulnerable we all are in this ball hurling through the sky. But this is what happened with astronomy, and the work of Jung and people doing Jungian work is to try to maintain. We want to get as clear a distinction of ourselves from the unconscious. We don't want to be unconscious. As Jung said, if we're unconscious, then the archetypes will rule our lives, and we will call it fate. We will say that fate has made us do this, when it's the archetypes, because we are been unconscious. So we want to be conscious, but we also need to be conscious of the roots of our being, which is represented, the connection to the roots of our being is represented by this, what Neumann and Edward Edinger have called the ego-self axis. So that's a lot to say about Jung's system. And now, as I go through the course, and for the rest of what I want to say today, is how astrology fits into all of that. Why is it useful? Well, as I said, one of the really empirical ways that we can look at this in terms of working with that system. See, with Jung, in order to develop that ego-self axis, in order to learn the technique of regulating those archetypal energies, he looks at dreams, and he encourages people to do what he called active imagination. And what we do in dreams and active imagination is identify symbols. And if we're going to identify symbols, that's only part of it, because then we have to understand, what does the symbol mean? What are we going to do with the symbol? How are we going to work with the symbol? Well, in order to, as I said earlier, amplify the symbols, in order to understand them through looking at parallel stories, parallel myths, parallel explanations, we look at things like alchemy, we look at things like fairy tales, we look at things like various mythologies, and we look at things like astrology. And Jung, as I say, used astrology quite a lot, not only for this mythological amplification purpose, but I want to start there, and then we'll tease out the rest of it as we go along. But he did use it, and when we talk about astrology as a mythological system and as a way to amplify unconscious symbols, I would like to focus on at least 4 important points that make astrology very useful to Jungian psychology. And in a couple of cases, it also demonstrates to us just how unique astrology is as a mythological system. So first, as I say, is amplification. This is Jung's technique, where he is able to use parallel ideas to tease out the meaning of symbols. And as I say, astrology is a superb system for this, for helping us to amplify and tease out the meaning of a dream or of an active imagination fantasy, and the symbols that arise doing that work. That's sort of the first level. That's, if there was nothing else, I mean, I'm convinced personally, I've never done this, but I'm convinced if a person never had an ephemeris, they never knew what was going on with the actual transits of the planets, they didn't even know their own birth date. If they just worked with a zodiacal, with the zodiac, looked at the circle, identified certain things that rang true for them, and then looked at different aspects of it, it would be very healing, and they could get a great deal out of it without ever even bringing in what we know as, sort of the grounded in the world aspect of astrology, which deals with the connection to where the planets are now, what are the aspects, what sign is this one, and what element is it in, all that kind of stuff. It's such a really superbly balanced system, as I'm going to mention in a second, that it's healing just on that level all by itself. And that's, as I say, the symmetry. As Jung has said, astrology contains the sum of all the psychological knowledge of antiquity. He said that in one of his early letters about astrology. And so looking at astrology just from that point of view, the sum of all psychological knowledge of antiquity means it ties in lots and lots and lots of early knowledge of the gods, early knowledge of the elements, how they tie in with health, how they tie in with psychological well-being, how they tie in with a person's relationship to the social body. And this knowledge is not only useful to us, as I say, even leaving out the question of transits and aspects and progression of planets and all that, but the system, as I say, is a perfectly balanced and symmetrical circle when we study it in the zodiac. And it has it's a mandala, or I won't get into it, but the mandala is one of the key symbols for constellating the archetype of the self. And they can be very, very calming. And so when you work, simply, as I say, work with the zodiac as a calming mandala and meditate upon it, and as I say, identify some characteristics in ourselves that we see in the zodiac that is either missing or is present. It's, for example, when an astrologer looks at your chart and sees that in my case, I have very little earth in my chart, and I'm great at being really up in the air. I have a lot of water and a lot of air in my chart, so I'm very good at being emotional. Play a lot of emotional music. I get up in the head with intellectual things, but it's very difficult for me to bring those things down to the mud and into the earth. And that's the kind of thing, even if you don't know where your chart is, when you know that you have a particular tendency and you just look at the opposite side of the chart because of the symmetry in it, you can learn a lot of how to bring that balance. And with Jung, it's always about balance, balancing the psyche and bringing everything into an easy working, or really a dynamically working flow of energy. So the final 2 points that make astrology really a fantastic system that's quite unique, I think. And this is the 2 philosophical questions of time and fate. Alchemy deals with the question of time to a certain extent, in the sense that it's a process that unfolds over time. However, alchemy does not depend on the cyclical repetitions of time that are so clearly evident in astrology. These contemplations on time and the cyclical nature of time is quite unique in Western mythology. In Eastern mythology, in both Chinese thought and particularly in Vedic thought, there's what they call the pralayas and the mahapralayas and the yugas, billions and billions of years that always repeat. In the West, we have linear time. There's a beginning of time, and there's an end of time, and then there's a judgment, and all of that. That's the way we tend to look at things. And the only place in the Western thought where these cycles are recognized, cycles of time are recognized in a mythological way that I know of, there may be others, but they all tend to tie up with astrology and astrological ideas. And this idea of an awareness of time, because time is one of the great mysteries that we deal with in life, this awareness and the way it is dealt with in astrology is quite unique. And the other one, the second of these points, is the question of fate. So from the earliest days of astrology, there were always those who claimed that everything was predetermined by the gods, and that this predetermination was reflected in the stars. And we'll see as we go through this course that that's changed a lot. Not for all astrologers, but for many astrologers, that's changed a lot. But even in ancient times, early philosophers criticized astrologers for saying that we have no self-efficacy and that everything was predetermined by the hour of our birth and the placement of the stars. Philosophers would emphasize that we each have free will and an individual capacity to control our own fate, and wherever we may fall on the spectrum between these two positions of self-determination and fated, the idea is that working with astrological ideas brings us again and again into conversation with these questions of free will, self-determination, and fate. So these two elements of time and fate are quite, when we really play with them and work with them in astrological terms, they bring it to a very different level than and bring it into a kind of present moment level in ways that other mythologies do not do. And again, I'm talking about leaving aside, we haven't even touched or thought about the actual movement of the planets or the aspects or the houses or the signs that the planets are in and all of that. That alone is a practically infinite variety of things, and we'll talk about some of that as we go through the course. But just these kind of bare ideas, these to me are archetypal ideas and dovetail perfectly with Jung and with his thought and with the kind of work that we do when we're doing Jungian therapy and Jungian work. So what I want to do also is give you a brief survey of what we're going to cover in the 8 modules of our full course. But before I do that, I want to say something about the books that the course will be based on and that we're going to draw from throughout the course. The textbook for the course is going to be Jung on Astrology. It's published by Routledge Books, which is a superb academic press. And like many of the books, this is not in the Encountering Jung series, but it really kind of models itself on the Encountering Jung series that Princeton University's press started putting out in the 90s. But this book, like those, collects a wide selection of quotes from Jung's letters and published writings where he mentions astrology. Now, in the case of astrology, this is more frustrating than some of these other books because, as I mentioned, Jung was reticent to speak too openly in his published work about his interest in astrology. So there's not a lot in his published work where he goes right into detail about dealing with astrological ideas. He does towards the end of his life in his book Ion, his work on synchronicity, in the synchronicity book, he does talk much more openly about astrology. But a lot of what we find in his books are, as I say, using it in terms of amplification. He'll rattle on about some topic, and then at some point he'll say this parallels, the sun god myth, which is central to such, and then he'll get into astrological connections to that, amplifications of that. But still, I wanted to stick with this Jung on Astrology book as the textbook because I think it's important for students to encounter Jung as he is before you start thinking about it and reading, rather than taking my word for it or reading some other author and what Jung thinks. It's important to get in touch with the primary sources. Now, another book, which I was very tempted to use as the textbook, is a book by the astrologer Liz Green entitled Jung's Studies in Astrology, Prophecy, Magic, and the Qualities of Time. Now, this is an excellent book. It's also published by Routledge, and it's written by an excellent scholar. She's also a Jungian analyst, and of course it has the benefit of being written by a highly respected astrologer who has practiced astrology for many years. Now, I chose the Jung on Astrology book rather than Liz Green's book, as I say, for 2 reasons. For one thing, it's important that we focus on Jung's words, like I said. But secondly, Liz Green is an excellent scholar, but her superb scholarship, very much like reading Jung himself, sometimes makes it very heavy going for people who are not used to reading academic writing. In any case, I'll be drawing a lot from ideas from Liz Green's book, so if you're interested in digging into that, she's also got another book which she talks only about how astrology and astrological ideas, which are very, very rich, in Jung's Red Book, which she calls Liber Novus. So she talks about, I think it's called something like Astrology and Liber Novus. But that's an excellent book that goes way, way beyond what we're going to cover in this course. But if you're not going to take the course and you just want to read up on Jung and astrology, all three of these books, excellent books. As I said, they're kind of tough going if you're not used to reading academically dense books, but they are superb in terms of scholarship and the quality of what you're going to find in them. So what I want to do now is quickly, we're kind of near the end of our hour, just going to quickly race through what is going to be covered in the 8 weeks, 8 modules of the course. First, to start off, as I said, there are going to be a lot of people who don't know a lot about astrology, and even if you do, of course, if you know a lot about astrology, you may not have any interest in this, but I'm going to not only cover the basics, but I'm going to try and tie them in, again, to Jung's astrology. The point is to tease these things out in a way where they resonate with Jung's ideas, but it's also just going to be an introduction to all the basic astrological symbols. Many of you will be familiar with some of them, perhaps not all of them. There's, of course, the 12 signs, the 12 houses, the 4 elements, earth, air, fire, and water, which correspond to Jung's 4 functions, and we'll get into that when we talk about those. Then there are the planets: Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn. Now, for Jung, a lot of his work, he worked with Alan Leo and a lot of early astrologers, and they did not pay much attention to the newer, what we call the outer planets, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. But those planets, and of course the sun and moon, which we don't really call planets, but and now of course they're not even calling Pluto planets, but we'll talk a little bit about those and some of the sort of archetypal associations with them. But the general meanings of all these constituent parts of the horoscope, a little bit about how they interact with one another, and a little bit of the archetypal background of each, and that'll kind of form common grounds, having covered some of Jung's theory today and then covering some basics of astrology. Then we can move with a little more confidence through a lot more material. Moving on, we'll go to Module 2 and cover some of the history of astrology, particularly the history of Western astrology. And this isn't just something to memorize dates and talk about the development of astrology or anything like that. We want to see how this ties in with Jung's astrology, how it ties in with the idea of archetypes, how astrology is rooted in, it's so ancient that it's really a deep, deep part of the human psyche. And as we say, it's been common throughout everywhere in the world, particularly in the very, very early times, the Neolithic times when agriculture was first being developed, and it was really people's survival depended on how well their tribal shaman could read the signs in the stars. And it's also important for practical reasons just to understand the psychological importance, and really it's kind of how, and when I showed you those developing differentiation of the ego from the self, that happens individually, but it also happens culturally. And there are different epochs in time where culture itself is a little bit more embedded in the unconscious, a little more mythopoetic, and not a lot of rational cognition functioning. And so we can trace some of that as we go through the development there. And of course, we'll be particularly interested in how it relates to the archetypes, the collective unconscious, and both the individuation process and the sort of cultural individuation process. So in Module 3, we're going to look at Jung's encounter with astrology, with how he first got started in it, why he was interested in it, how it developed for him, and how it really appears throughout his life from I think it was 1911 when it first, the first letter to Freud appeared. He was still with Freud then. And then 1913, of course, was when he published Symbols of Transformation. And he mentions astrology there, and it weaves its way through, all the way through his work, through his whole life. And we're just going to begin to dig into it in Module 3. And then sort of a companion to that module is getting into the specifics of how he understood astrology, through the lens of uh, several early astrologers, and some of whom he got a lot from, and others he did not. Alan Leo was a very important one, mainly because he was important. He was one of the early, late 19th century popularizers of astrology, and he was also one of the first because he dealt with what he called esoteric astrology rather than exoteric astrology. He began to see astrology being meaningful for the inner world, not just for the outer world. And this, of course, resonated with Jung quite a lot, who developed that to really a fine art, the way he understood astrology and worked on it as a part of this inner process. And that, as we'll see, particularly in the final module, Module 8, how that has impacted contemporary astrology. So then in Module 5, we'll dig right into some of the key writings where he speaks quite a lot about astrology. And that's, of course, he does it in his letters, but he talks at length about, of course, Ion is a sort of a god of time. So he talks about the age of Pisces and the age of the fishes, and he goes into a lot of astrological ideas in Ion. And then, of course, synchronicity was his support. His book Synchronicity and Acausal Connecting Principle was his way. It was really a failed attempt to try to design an experiment that would provide an explanatory model for how astrology works. Because, as we'll see, it doesn't work the way we think it does. It works, and I'm going to make the claim that it works. It certainly works on the psyche, and it does something, and I heartily endorse it as something that's valuable, but it doesn't work the way we tend to think it works. And Jung recognized this and was trying to come up with an explanatory model. And for a lot of people, his ideas of synchronicity are some of the most useful ideas, even though his experiment is kind of a failure on a failure on many levels. Still, his basic idea is a good one, I think, and many people think. So Module 6, we're going to dig into, having seen all that, we're going to dig into the archetypal symbolism and how that contributes to, and how we can understand its contributions to the individuation process and its contributions to how we understand this process of differentiating the psyche and stewarding archetypal energies, and rather than being completely alienated from them or being completely possessed by them. And then with our final two modules, we'll get into some sort of less in the archetypal realm and more into these questions, as I talked about, the questions of time and fate and the philosophical and scientific problems that are confronted by astrology. And again, we'll talk a lot more about synchronicity in this module, because we'll see why. I'm going to offer my own ideas as to why the kind of scientific studies and statistical analyses and things of astrology don't work, and why that doesn't disqualify astrology from having value. But it's a complex topic, and hopefully we'll have enough background by the time we get here to look more at that. And then we'll look finally at Jung's influence on contemporary astrology. There's a lot of wonderful contemporary astrologers who work with his ideas, and with a lot of astrology, it's just people probably don't even realize how much they've gotten from Jung, because it's just so kind of absorbed into the culture of astrologers and the way they work with charts and people, and, as I say, this sort of amplification and this way of cross-referencing these different threads of archetypal and symbolic ideas as they move through the astrological chart. And the author of that book I was mentioning, Liz Green, is certainly one person who's she's been controversial, but she's very, very respected by many, many people as an astrologer. And there are others who we'll discuss who also make a lot of were kind of transformative in the way they influenced astrology because of the influence of Jung. So that's a very quick review of an ancient and complex topic. It's also an overview of the broad outlines of what we're going to try to cover in our 8-week course of Jung and Astrology. We could, of course, spend weeks and weeks and weeks on Jung and Astrology. We could spend weeks and years just on astrology without even bringing Jung into it. We could spend years just talking about Jung. So I'm going to try to distill it down to ways that everybody, with all of these courses that I do, I try to provide you with some solid grounding so that when we hit on something that is of particular interest to you, then you can go ahead and do some further research and explore it in the direction, take it in the direction that you want to go. I teach primarily what we call classical Jungian psychology, grounded in Jung and what Jung said. There's been a lot of developments in astrology, but rather in Jungian psychology and astrology, but in Jungian psychology. And if you know what Jung was thinking, what he said, what he did, then you are able to decide for yourself which one of these threads, where people have taken them in different directions, which way you would like to go. So if you found this, what I've presented today, interesting, I hope you'll consider signing up for the full 8-week course, Jung and Astrology. And in the meantime, I want to thank you all for being attentive, and anyone who wants to hang around and ask questions or have comments or anything at all. And if there are, I bet you there's more than one astrologer out there who may be able to correct me on things I've said, but I welcome that too. So thank you all, and let me know if you have any thoughts or questions or concerns. I know somebody's got to have some thoughts.
I'll speak. Hi, I'm Taylor.
Hi, Taylor.
Hello. Thank you very much. I received an email announcement about this course from the Depth Psychology website or organization, and it far exceeded my expectations today, and it re-stimulates me in a way that I've been very thirsty for. So thank you very much.
You're welcome. I'm glad you liked it. Thanks.
Yeah, really great.
Thank you. Any question or thought, or any sharing anything you were stimulated?
This is Christina Malone, and I was
very
interested in it. I've been an astrologer for about 40 years, and
40.
Yeah, and
wow.
And I really love it because it does seem to me that it's like meant to be for the modern times. Even though it's so ancient, I call it the psychology of the modern times because I use it in that way. I've always known that Jung was interested in astrology, and there's a couple of movies out about him doing that, but I didn't know as much detail as this particular segment offered. So I really appreciate your wisdom and your knowledge. So thank you. And I've got all my picture is a picture of all the archetypes of the signs of the zodiac in their star form.
Huh.
I actually got it from a kids program on Microsoft a very long time ago. It's really, so it's it's on my website. So I just love it because it shows the stars in their original form.
Great. Thank you. Yeah, I'm glad you like I would never, I was interested too in Jung and his interest in astrology, and it's only in the last couple of years that these books came out. I could never have attempted a course like this, but these, as I say, 3 wonderful books have come out. I haven't read the third one. The Red Book is a whole other realm that you can get really can be a rabbit hole. But these 2 I highly recommend if you're interested in Jung and his work with astrology. They've kind of allowed me, I had a general sense of what he was up to, but these grounded me a lot more in what and how it kind of all fits together. But thank you, and thanks for coming.
Sure.
I had a question for you. Oh,
yes.
Sorry, go on. Oh, my name's Stevie. Hi, James. Thanks for conducting us today. I'm just curious, obviously your background's in Jungian psychology. with this course and I guess this interest, are you a skeptic or believer, I guess, and when it comes to astrology?
Well,
And then also,
that's
I
it.
was just curious
Go
what
ahead.
your sign was as well.
Ah, my let me see. My sun sign is Cancer. My rising sign is Virgo. That's the only Earth I have in my whole chart. My moon is
I was
in.
shocked when you said you were minimal Earth. I was like, there's got to be an Earth rising afoot.
Yeah. That's luckily, yeah. I wouldn't have anything, but yeah, I even have Saturn is in Scorpio, so that's like a real mess right there. But so I don't like the word believer because I don't think Jung was a believer in anything, and yet he believed in all this stuff. It's I was absolutely a skeptic, and then when you start fooling with these things, there's something going on there. So I can't say and it's also, for example, like I say, I teach religious studies, and when someone says, "Well, do you believe in God?" Well, that's how can you even answer that? Because what God are you talking about? What does God even mean to you? When you say God, do you mean the bearded guy on the Sistine Chapel, or do you mean the Vedic God, or do you mean a goddess, or there's do you mean an ethereal oneness of the universe that somehow generated life forms and all that, or what? How do you define God? You can't answer what you believe in, and in terms of astrology, I mean, I absolutely approached it just as a curiosity, I guess you would say, but there's something going on there. So it's not that I like believe. I don't put a lot of stock in predictions of any kind. I've never seen an astrologer really be good at predictions, and predictions tend to be, for example, there's a wonderful in this book I was talking about I forget the name of the book, but it's History of Astrology, and he cites a guy who was one of the most successful financiers, Wall Street people ever, made millions and millions of dollars, and he used astrology, but he did not use astrology by itself. He knew a lot about the markets. He knew a lot about people. He knew a lot about businesses, and he used. I think of astrology as being like the weather. He used the astrological weather to determine various choices that he made. So again, what different people in different systems of astrology give different kinds of credence to different things. And there's definitely something going on, whether it's all happening in the psyche or whether it's all tied up to planetary movement. I don't really know how it works or what's even going on, but I know it's valuable. As Jung said, if he had a very difficult case, he would create a chart, and it would always give him an insight that he didn't have otherwise. And there could be many reasons for that, like some that I mentioned before. But I mean, I've seen very clearly that, for example, hard aspects. If you know, I don't know how much people know about the nuts and bolts of astrology, but when there's a hard aspect in a chart, you can almost always see how that's manifested in the person's life if you understand all the different, the elements and the aspects, the planets involved, and the houses and the signs involved, and the rulerships of signs is a very important part of that. When you read all those things, and again, is that some kind of synchronicity? Is it I don't know what it is, but so again, that's a long answer to a short question. Whether I believe it, I believe what I see, and I see very, very, very compelling things coming out of astrology. But there are some astrology also is like alchemy, in that there were a lot of people doing alchemy who made claims that they could not substantiate. And there are people who do astrology who make claims that they cannot substantiate. It's easy for someone to be a con man. And it's true with psychotherapy too. Con men infiltrate the psychotherapeutic world. Con men infiltrate the astrological world, and they infiltrate everybody. So I have a very I try to not be a skeptic but a realist, and as I say, when I see really compelling evidence, I take note, and I definitely take a lot of note of what's going on in astrology. Does that
I'm an astrologer, and I can agree there's many grifters. So, kudos to all the above. Yeah, thank you.
Sure. Thanks, Stevie. Any other thoughts?
Yeah,
questions?
I have a question about the word artificial, and let me make sure I'm understanding you. So, like the spiritual journey or the individuation journey is different. The ordinary person lives an ordinary life, and it's an artificial. And is that a Jungian term? Can you just say more about this? I've never heard someone use
Those terms, I got those, and I'm not even sure if she uses the word artificial, but there's a book by Yolanda Jacoby, who is a friend and colleague and patient of Jung's. I think it's the one called Individuation. It's a wonderful book. It's very difficult to find these days, but it's a wonderful book. Encapsulates. It was written before much had been written about Jung. I think it was written during Jung's lifetime or soon after he passed away, and there wasn't much written. But she encapsulates that well. So she's the one who says that, in other words, Jung did not invent individuation. He observed it. It's kind of like what I was saying to Stevie about astrology. Is that I make observations and I try to respond to those observations. And with individuation, Jung observed that this is what's happening. So the natural individuation process is the individuation process that we hear Buddhists say that the dog has a dog nature, and the the wolf has a wolf nature, and the bear has a bear nature, and hopefully we have a Buddha nature, and we aspire to our Buddha nature. Well, these are sort of archetypal ideas, I would say, and when we fulfill that, that's the natural. When that happens naturally, we have a natural individuation process. The dog and the bear and the animals in the forest have a natural individuation process. The oak tree has a natural individuation process. Because for human beings, the natural individuation process was always mediated as we develop more and more hyper-rational consciousness that dissociated us from the roots of our instinctual beings. We developed religious practices, spiritual practices, and mythological systems that helped us to maintain that link, that ego-self-axis. And those processes are also part of a natural individuation process. What I'm calling an artificial process is and of course we want it very much to be natural, but we need to, but we intervene on it through the intervention of the conscious mind, trying to steward the process. The intervention of the conscious mind through doing therapy, through doing dream work, through doing active imagination, through having a therapist, through having a group, however we approach it, that's what I'm calling the artificial, or that's what she calls the artificial individuation process. That it's a process that we have invented to try to get back to the natural one. The goal always is to be back to a natural one, but we need to have a myth. We need to have a mythological system that we can really invest 100% in. Part of the problem with modernity, Jung says, is because of the Enlightenment. People question so much that they just don't believe in anything anymore. And we need to find a mythological system, something that we can really believe in. And so that would be, again, working towards that is artificial, but the goal is to kind of naturally reconnect with these roots of our instinctual and the core of our being. Does that explain what you wanted to know?
Yeah, that's great. And there's some questions in the chat.
Yes. What do we have? I don't know if I should start at the beginning or let's see.
I just wanted to ask quickly, where you just ended your sentence, is the instinctual also directly related to the numinous? I thought I heard you say that toward the beginning. There's or an awareness of the numinous.
Yeah, no. Well, there's Jung, and it depends on how kind of fine tuned we want to get about it. Jung made a distinction between archetypes and instincts, so that's a little problematic to cross those lines too much. But he defined archetypal as being something that is experienced numinously. In other words, he said that you can have a mother symbol, or you can talk all kinds of archetypes, but if there's no emotion involved, then then it's not an archetype. An archetype has not been constellated until the emotion is involved. And the emotion is, if you're familiar with Rudolf Otto, where he got the term numinous, it's the description, using descriptive words to describe religious experience. William James had written this book, The Varieties of Religious Experience, and then Rudolf Otto kind of followed that up by describing the emotional the emotional aspects of religious experience. He used terms like mysterium tremendum, the tremendous mystery, and the mysterium the fascinating mystery, and the numinosum, which is just that which causes this sort of field of sacrality. And Jung said whenever we experience that field of sacrality, we're in touch with an archetype. So to the extent that where there's a kind of crossover between the instinct and the archetype, then yes. Have I said too
Thank
much?
you. Well done.
Thank you. I hope that helped. I may have
It
given
did.
you way
Thank
more
you.
than you wanted to know.
It was great.
Hi, James. I had put a question on the chat,
Yes.
but I answered it by looking at the website. So I had one other practical kind of question, though. I'm really interested in this in terms of like how you talked about it being the archetypes of the zodiac and how Jung looks at that. That's kind of where I dig into the curiosity on this stuff. So I was wondering when you would also be offering the Jung and the myths and Jung and the fairy tales.
Well, those, we're in the process now of putting them all, making them videos on demand so that people can just take them whenever, because it's not practical to try to teach them over and over and over again, because there's not that many people want to take them at the same time. And so I'm trying to put them on video on demand. I've got Jung 101, which is all about theory. Jung 102 will be up certainly before this course is over, I hope. That's applied Jungian psychology. And that's going to be followed with the course on dreams and active imagination. Then we start with myth, fairy tales, and alchemy. But if there's interest, I've got the old videos from the live classes, and I can make those available to people. At first I wasn't, but there's been so much interest, and I'm taking me a long time to get all these things. I want to do a really good job on the videos. I want to do a good job on the classes when they're online. So it's taking a little while to get that done. But if you email me, I can talk to you about making those available.
Thank you.
Sure.
James, I have a question.
Yes. And who's this?
Anita.
Hi, Anita.
How are you? I really enjoyed the lecture.
Thank you.
Can we isolate the unities, or we have to take the whole course? I'm not sure I can commit to the 8 segments of your course.
It is it is a full course, but it's everything is recorded, and we have an online. Also, people should know that you don't need to read the books or do the assignments and things. We give a certificate if you do the assignments and read the textbook and all that, but you don't need to do that. But these will all be the following. For example, this talk is provided technology cooperates, will be online available for people in the course, and I'm going to make it available because this is the free one. It'll be available to everybody, but we put this on the course on Monday, so next week when I do module 1, the following Monday the video will be available, and it'll be available for at least 6 months, so you don't have to take them all. You don't have to be there at the day of the class, if that was your question.
Understand. Okay, yeah. I was just thinking of more specific aspects that I would like to know better, bypassing the beginning, like the elements. And I know it's going to be very interesting, but I've studied it for a while as well. Sure. So, okay, but I'll think about it.
Sure.
Thanks,
you, Anita. Thank you. Anyone else got any thoughts? Questions? Great to have you all come. I appreciate it.
There's a lot more questions in the chat.
Oh, okay. Can you read one to me, or can you find them? I don't know where they are. Hold on. Could the mythological system of astrology be thought of as a collective symbol of the cosmological self? And likewise, is the personal symbolic function of one's astrological chart more than a chart for individuation, but also an orientation to the individual's relation to the cosmic psyche as self? Anne, you want to
Hi,
say more about
James.
that? Hi.
Those are big questions. It sounds like module 7 kinds of questions. So
Well, yeah, either that or you're trying to submit a dissertation proposal.
not quite.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, sure. I mean, whether you're an astrologer or a Jungian or both or whatever, we circumscribe and decide what it is that we're doing. So, that is an interest. The first part is it a collective symbol of the cosmological self? I mean, you'd have to define cosmological self. I mean, it certainly could be considered a symbol of the self. The self is the self, and the self is an archetype, and it's only the archetype and the symbol are not the same thing, and we never see the archetype, but you say symbol. So yeah, and well, the thing, if by cosmological self you mean that when we look at the evening sky and we think of the cosmos as such, and we internalize that, we see that as that's what the vastness of my own soul, soul being psyche, that represents the vastness of it. So in that sense, yeah, I mean, I still think it's these things, just as Jung said that the emotion has to be there for it, or the numinosity has to be there for it to be an archetype. Likewise, it has to be my soul. It's not. It may be common to everyone, but it's only meaningful if it's mine and I have an emotional connection to it. You see what I mean?
Yeah, I'm very interested in cosmology and consciousness, so I can see the individual aspect of it that's so obvious, but I sometimes think that there's like this series of nested selves. There's the individual self, there's an earth as self, and there's a universe as self,
Yeah. Yeah, but those are only, I mean, there's two, again, this always happens in these classes, as you know. Anne has taken, I think, all of our courses so far. But as you know, there comes a point when we slip from the empirical things that we're able to discern scientifically or observationally, and then there's the realm of the metaphysical. And so you're right at and you love to dance on that edge, I know.
Yeah.
So you're right at the edge of metaphysics, and we can't,
It's true. Yeah. The second part of my question is like an extension of that first question. So it's not exactly repeating it, but it's more about the individual experience of self in relationship to the cosmic psyche, really, is kind of what I'm saying about the personal symbolic function of it. But I think some of these things may be in Rick Tarnas's Cosmos and Psyche, which I haven't.
I was going to say that when you first said it, I was going to say you need to be.
I know, I need to read that, and I haven't yet. So.
Well, that's a bit biting off quite a lot there. But the thing is, and it's kind of like what I was saying before, is that a lot of times when we do astrology, we look at a chart, but to find a place where you can actually see the evening sky, it's not bathed in artificial light, or even just looking at photographs of it, being cognizant of where we are in the midst of this mass cosmos is itself the kind of thing that a lot of Jungian work is about relativizing the ego, bringing the ego, cutting the ego down, and you cannot really, it's very difficult at least to spend much time looking at the evening sky and contemplating the cosmos and the cosmological reality that we exist in without being humbled, without your ego being trimmed down very, very quickly, at least if you're kind of being honest and being present in the moment. So to that extent, regardless of the details of your question, I think all of that is true, and we even feel more, I think, connected to other humans when we realize that all humans are sharing that experience of being in this vast cosmic sea.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you very much for tackling that one,
Sure.
James.
That was a good question. That's and once you get into Pacifica, you can think about that for your dissertation.
Right. Thank you.
Sure. Anyone else? Any other thoughts? Happy to hang out. If not, I'm going to say thank you all. I hope you will think about signing up for the course. This is how we keep the Depth Psychology Alliance going, is through these courses. And happy that my great joy is always being able to talk about Jung and these things with people. And this is a particularly fun area. That's going to be very it's going to be very interesting when we get into all of the different levels of this, I think. Had another, okay, yeah. All right, everyone, I'm going to sign off. I appreciate
Thank
it.
you.
Thank you all for coming. If you have any questions, feel free to email me or just let me know. I appreciate it, everyone, and we'll see you somewhere on campus.